Imagine being 35 years old and unable to make a simple phone call. Not because you don't know how the phone works, but because the moment something unexpected happens in the conversation, fear takes over and you hang up. It sounds small on the surface, but maybe the phone isn't the real problem at all. Maybe the real question is deeper. What happens when someone grows up so protected from uncertainty that they never discover what they're actually capable of when the unknown appears? Think about that situation for a moment. Someone reaches their mid-30s and has never held a job. Not because they lack intelligence, not because they don't understand how work operates, but because something as ordinary as using a phone feels overwhelming. The problem appears simple on the surface. Just pick up the phone, dial the number, speak. But the moment the conversation takes an unexpected turn, panic floods in. The person freezes, stumbles, and eventually hangs up. So, what exactly are they afraid of? It's easy to assume they're afraid of the phone itself, but that's not really true. The phone is only the stage where the real fear appears. What they're actually afraid of is the unpredictable nature of human interaction. The moment when the other person says something you didn't expect. The moment when the conversation steps outside the script you were hoping to follow. That tiny moment of uncertainty is enough to trigger something much deeper. Because if you've never learned how to deal with the unexpected, then every deviation from the plan feels like a kind of collapse. The structure you were holding on to disappears, and suddenly you're standing in the unknown with no idea what to do next. And that often traces back much further than people realize. Sometimes the real story begins in childhood. Imagine growing up in an environment where you were protected from every possible risk. Every uncomfortable situation smoothed over before it had the chance to unfold. Every uncertain interaction handled for you. On the surface, that can look like care, even kindness. But there's a hidden cost. Because when children never encounter the unknown, they never discover something crucial about themselves. They never discover that there is something inside them that can respond when things go wrong. Children who face small challenges learn something remarkable. They encounter fear. They stumble. They feel the tension of not knowing what will happen next. But then they improvise. They try something. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But through that process, they discover a resource inside themselves that reveals itself only when it's needed. If that opportunity never comes, the discovery never happens. So years later, the person staring at the phone doesn't just doubt their conversational skills. They doubt something much deeper. They doubt that they have the capacity to deal with the unexpected at all. And when you believe that every unpredictable moment feels like a threat, now you could approach the situation in a very technical way. You could teach them scripts, a list of standard phrases, small talk templates, ways to steer conversations safely. That might help a little because it expands what they know. It gives them more structure. But there's another approach that works at a deeper level. Instead of trying to eliminate the unknown, you help them learn how to face it. Imagine telling them something very simple. When the other person says something you didn't expect, don't panic. Pause for a moment. Listen carefully. Think about what they actually said. Give yourself the time to form a response. Most conversations allow that space, even if it doesn't feel like it at first. And maybe the first few attempts won't go well. Maybe the first 6 calls will feel awkward, clumsy, even embarrassing. That's normal. Learning any skill involves that stage where you're doing it badly. But something interesting begins to happen if the person keeps trying. Gradually, they notice that the unknown doesn't destroy them. The conversation moves forward. They answer a question. They recover from a mistake. They survive the moment they feared the most. And each time that happens, a quiet realization grows stronger. Maybe I can actually handle this. Not perfectly, not effortlessly, but well enough. And that realization changes everything. Because the person who once believed they had no capacity to deal with the unexpected begins to see evidence that the opposite might be true. That there is something inside them capable of responding, adapting, and learning. The phone call becomes more than a phone call. It becomes the first place where they glimpse a hidden resource they never knew they had. Now step back for a moment and consider something broader about human life. Every person who enters the world arrives carrying two things at the same time: possibilities and limitations. We tend to focus on the possibilities, what we might become, what we might achieve. But the limitations are just as important, even if we rarely like to admit it. Your body itself is the first example. The particular form you inhabit allows certain things and prevents others. You can walk, speak, grasp objects with your hands, think in complex patterns. But there are also countless things you simply cannot do. You cannot fly under your own power. You cannot breathe underwater. You cannot be everywhere at once. At first glance, those limitations might seem like obstacles, but they do something else at the same time. They give shape to what is possible. Think of it this way. Imagine a world where there were absolutely no constraints at all. No boundaries, no rules, no structure. In a place like that, action itself would lose its meaning. Without limits, there would be nothing to push against, nothing to navigate, nothing to work within. And this becomes much easier to understand if you think about something as simple as a game. Take chess, for example. When you sit down to play chess, the first thing you encounter is a whole set of restrictions. Each piece moves in a specific way. The rook can only move in straight lines. The bishop moves diagonally. The knight jumps in its strange L-shaped pattern. You cannot suddenly decide that your pawn can move like a queen, or that your king can sprint across the board. In fact, there are far more things you cannot do in chess than things you can. But strangely enough, those limitations don't feel unfair when you're playing. They don't feel like a burden imposed from outside. They feel like the very structure that makes the game possible in the first place. Without those rules, there would be no strategy, no tension, no challenge. If every piece could move anywhere at any time, the entire game would collapse into chaos. Nothing meaningful could happen because nothing would have a defined form. The restrictions are what make the game playable. And something similar seems to apply to life itself. The particular combination of abilities and constraints that each person carries becomes the framework within which their life unfolds. Your talents guide you in certain directions. Your limitations push you away from others. And within that structure, something like a personal path begins to take shape. It's easy to resent the things you cannot do. Everyone does that at times. But there's another way to look at it. The boundaries around you are not only walls. In many ways, they are the outlines that give your life its form. Just as the pieces on a chessboard move within their specific patterns, human beings move within a structure defined by their biology, their emotions, their motivations, and their circumstances. And within that structure, the real question begins to emerge. Given the limits you have, what kind of game are you going to play? If you look closely at human life, you start to notice that none of us enters the world as a blank slate. We arrive already carrying a set of emotions, motivations, and tendencies. Hunger, curiosity, fear, pride, affection, resentment. These aren't inventions of culture. They're built into us long before we ever learn language or rules or traditions. And those shared emotional structures are part of the reason communication is even possible. When someone smiles, we understand something about that immediately. When someone expresses anger or grief, we recognize it without needing a manual. Beneath all the complexity of culture, there is a biological layer that we all share. But here's where things get interesting. When many individuals, each carrying their own emotions and motivations, begin interacting with each other over long periods of time, something starts to emerge. Not through careful planning, and not because someone sat down and designed it perfectly from the beginning. Instead, it forms slowly through endless negotiation. You want something. I want something. Our desires overlap in some places and clash in others. So we adjust, we compromise, we push back, we cooperate. Over time, patterns start to form out of those interactions, and those patterns become the foundation of social life. You can actually see the roots of this process even in animals. Researchers studying rats discovered something fascinating when observing how they play with each other. Rats, like many social animals, engage in rough and tumble play. They wrestle, they chase, they knock each other over. At first glance, it just looks like chaos. But if you watch closely, there are hidden rules. Typically, one rat becomes dominant over another. And interestingly, it doesn't take much to create that dominance. Even a small difference in size or weight, something like 10%, is often enough for one rat to consistently win during these encounters. Now, you might think that means the stronger rat simply wins every time. But that's not what happens. In fact, the subordinate rat is usually the one who invites play. It approaches, signals the invitation, and the two begin wrestling. But here's the surprising part. If the dominant rat wins too often, if it pins the weaker rat more than about 70% of the time, the weaker rat stops playing entirely. It simply walks away. The game collapses. Why? Because even among rats, the game has to remain fair enough that both participants continue to benefit from it. If one participant dominates too completely, the other refuses to participate. Now imagine how that principle might apply to human beings. Any cooperative activity, whether it's a friendship, a workplace, a family, or an entire society, operates something like a game. People participate as long as their basic emotional and motivational needs are acknowledged within that structure. But if the structure becomes too one-sided, something begins to break down. If a person feels constantly exploited, ignored, or crushed by the system they're part of, they eventually withdraw from it, or they rebel against it, or they begin searching for a different system altogether. And this isn't just a theoretical idea. History is full of examples where societies became so imbalanced that large portions of the population could no longer tolerate the game they were forced to play. Imagine a society where most people are starving, where their basic needs are ignored, where oppression becomes constant. Under those conditions, people begin imagining alternatives. They start asking questions about how things could be different. They begin dreaming of new arrangements. And if the imbalance becomes severe enough, those dreams eventually turn into action. That's where revolutionary movements come from. They aren't usually born from abstract philosophical theories alone. They emerge when the game of society becomes intolerable for too many of the people forced to play it. But long before revolutions occur, something quieter is happening. Across generations, people are constantly adjusting the ways they live together. Every disagreement, every negotiation, every attempt to solve conflict adds another piece of information about what works and what doesn't. Over time, those accumulated experiences begin to crystallize into patterns, and eventually those patterns are captured in stories. Stories become one of the earliest ways societies preserve the lessons learned from countless human interactions. They encode the behaviors that tend to lead toward harmony and the behaviors that tend to lead toward chaos. Later, as societies become more complex and conscious, reflection develops those patterns, sometimes become something even more explicit. They become laws. There's an ancient story that illustrates this process beautifully. According to tradition, before the famous commandments were ever written down, Moses spent years doing something far less dramatic, but incredibly revealing. People would come to him with their disputes, arguments between neighbors, conflicts within families, disagreements over property or promises, and Moses would listen. Then he would decide how the conflict should be resolved. He did this for hours every day, year after year, people lining up with their problems asking for judgment. Now imagine the effect of doing that for a decade. After hearing thousands upon thousands of disputes, patterns would begin to emerge. Certain types of solutions would repeatedly restore peace. Other responses would make things worse. Gradually, those patterns could be abstracted. The wisdom gained through countless lived interactions could be distilled into general principles. And eventually, those principles could be written down as laws. In that sense, laws are often not inventions created out of thin air by pure reason. They are the crystallized memory of generations of human negotiation. They are the attempt to formalize the patterns that allowed people to live together without tearing each other apart. When you look at it that way, social order doesn't appear as something imposed suddenly by a brilliant thinker. It looks more like something that slowly grows out of the emotional and motivational lives of real people interacting across time. And that long process, messy, imperfect, and deeply human, is what gradually shapes the games we all end up playing together. Now consider another possibility that shifts the way we think about our own minds. What if human beings don't primarily understand the world like logical machines at all? What if our thinking is shaped by something far older than rational argument? After all, long before human beings could speak in complex sentences or write philosophical systems, we already existed as living creatures navigating the world. For hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors survived without formal reasoning, without explicit theories about reality. without carefully constructed systems of logic. Yet they still had to act. They had to decide where to go, who to trust, what to fear, and how to respond when something unexpected appeared in front of them. So the structures that guide our thinking today were shaped during that long evolutionary period. They were shaped while we were still animals, in the most literal sense creatures, whose understanding of the world came through experience, emotion, and action, rather than through abstract calculation. That might explain something curious about human culture. Across different civilizations, across different continents and time periods, people repeatedly organize their understanding of life through stories, not equations, not instruction manuals, stories. Stories seem to be the natural language through which human beings make sense of the world. They describe situations, characters, conflicts, and transformations. They show what happens when someone faces danger, when someone makes a mistake, when someone learns something important. And when you begin examining those stories closely, certain patterns appear again and again. One of the most common patterns centers around three fundamental figures: the mother, the father, and the individual hero. At first, that might sound symbolic or abstract, but if you step back and think about it, these are the categories every human being encounters from the very beginning of life. Every person who has ever lived entered a world that already contained mothers, fathers, and individuals struggling to find their own path. If you imagine the perspective of a very young child, this becomes even clearer. At the earliest stages of life, the outside world is vague and difficult to understand. Everything beyond immediate experience is blurry and undefined. But certain figures stand out with enormous clarity. For a child, the mother often appears as something like the entire world. She is the source of food, comfort, warmth, and protection. The child depends on her for survival, so the mother becomes the center of experience itself. Then there is the father, or the secondary authority figure who brings both support and challenge. Sometimes protection, sometimes discipline, sometimes guidance into the larger world beyond the immediate safety of the mother. And then there is the child as an individual slowly becoming aware of their own separate existence. So from the very beginning, the child's understanding of reality is organized around these three elements: the nurturing source, the ordering or guiding presence, and the emerging individual navigating between them. Now imagine the earliest humans trying to understand the wider world outside their families. They were facing forests, storms, animals, night and day, life and death forces, far larger than anything they could easily comprehend. How do you even begin describing something you don't understand? One way is to use the categories you already know. You talk about the unknown using the language of familiar experience. So the world itself begins to resemble something like a vast mother, capable of giving life, but also capable of taking it away. The social order begins to resemble something like a father, imposing structure, rules, and expectations. And within that world stands the individual person, the one who must move through it, confront challenges, and figure out how to live. Over time, these patterns become embedded in stories. The hero who leaves the familiar world, the authority that represents order and tradition, the mysterious or unpredictable realm that both nurtures and threatens. You can see versions of this pattern appear again and again across myths, legends, and religious traditions. But the important point is that these patterns probably didn't emerge because someone invented them deliberately. They emerged because they reflect something deeply rooted in human experience. Our minds were shaped by countless generations of people who had to navigate a world filled with uncertainty. And the stories they told were not just entertainment. They were attempts to map the structure of reality in a way that human beings could actually live inside. So when we look at those recurring characters, the mother, the father, and the individual hero, we may not just be looking at symbols. We may be looking at some of the oldest categories through which human beings have ever tried to understand the world. Once you begin looking at the world through that lens, something else becomes clear. The world we live in is never just one thing. It doesn't move in a single direction. It isn't purely generous, and it certainly isn't purely cruel. Instead, it carries both possibilities at the same time. It gives with one hand and takes with the other. You can see this most clearly in nature itself. The same natural world that produces food, sunlight, and the conditions that allow life to grow is also the world that brings storms, disease, drought, and death. The forest that feeds you can also swallow you. The ocean that sustains entire ecosystems can turn violent without warning. Nature nurtures life, but it is never gentle in any permanent sense. The same strange balance appears in the social world. Society is what allows individuals to survive and develop. Without other people, without shared knowledge, without cooperation across generations, human life would collapse almost instantly. Language, technology, education, and culture are all social creations. They allow us to become far more than isolated individuals ever could. And yet, that same social structure can also press down on the individual with enormous force. Societies can nurture growth, but they can also restrict freedom. They can provide opportunity, but they can also enforce conformity, suppress difference, and sometimes crush the very people they helped create. The structure that protects you can also become the structure that traps you. Then there is the individual human being. If you look honestly at yourself or anyone else, you see the same pattern again. People are capable of remarkable things. Acts of courage, generosity, creativity, and resilience that can transform lives and shape entire communities. But those same individuals also carry the potential for cruelty, selfishness, deception, and destruction. The depths of human depravity can be just as astonishing as the heights of human virtue. And that means every person lives with a kind of internal duality, a capacity for what is admirable and a capacity for what is deeply troubling. When you place these three layers together, nature, society, and the individual, you begin to see the shape of the world we actually inhabit. A world that nurtures and threatens. A world that supports and resists. A world that offers hope but never guarantees safety. And within that world, each life unfolds as a path through problems. You encounter obstacles that test you, conflicts that force decisions, situations that reveal what you are capable of and what you are not yet ready to face. Some people respond by finding solutions, gradually learning how to navigate those tensions. Others become overwhelmed by them, unable to reconcile the contradictions they encounter. But either way, the path forward is shaped by those encounters. Life isn't lived in a perfectly balanced environment where everything moves smoothly. It unfolds in a place where opposing forces are always present. And the question each person eventually faces is simple, even if the answer is not. What will you do with the problems that world places in front of you? Now imagine trying to describe the unknown itself. Not just the things you haven't figured out yet, but the vast, overwhelming field of everything that lies beyond what you currently understand. Across many ancient stories, that unknown often takes the form of something dramatic and unforgettable, a dragon. At first, that might sound like pure fantasy, but the image carries a surprising amount of meaning. The dragon is usually portrayed as something ancient, enormous, and dangerous. A creature that guards something valuable, something capable of destruction, but also something connected to creation and transformation. In many traditions, the dragon represents totality, the chaotic source out of which everything else eventually takes shape. Picture it symbolically, a serpent-like creature that can crawl across the ground tied to the material world. But sometimes it also has wings capable of rising into the air. In one image, heaven and earth combined, matter and spirit intertwined, a being that seems to contain everything within itself. And there's something else strange about the serpent. It sheds its skin. Again and again it renews itself, ancient yet always transforming. That's part of why this creature appears so often in stories about beginnings. In old creation myths, the world frequently emerges out of a confrontation with chaos, often represented by a dragon or serpent-like force. Something immense and frightening that must be faced before order can exist. But before any heroic battle takes place, something more basic happens first. The encounter. When a human being first meets the unknown, it rarely appears as a clear concept. It doesn't show up as a tidy problem waiting for logical analysis. Instead, the first thing that appears is a feeling, a jolt of uncertainty, something like fear mixed with attention. Think about what happens when you suddenly encounter something you cannot categorize. Maybe someone says something that completely catches you off guard. Maybe a situation unfolds that you've never experienced before. For a moment, your mind doesn't know what to do with it. Your perception sharpens. your body tightens. Your attention locks onto the situation. Before you have words for it, before you understand what it means, you simply recognize one thing. This is unknown. That reaction is older than thought itself. It's a primordial signal that prepares you to deal with something new. Only after that initial moment does the mind begin constructing a clearer picture. You start analyzing what's happening. You try to interpret the signals. You slowly turn chaos into something more structured. But the first encounter is raw. It's the dragon of chaos appearing at the edge of your world. Now here's where things become even more interesting. The unknown doesn't appear exactly the same for everyone. There is the unknown as such, the infinite complexity of the world that no one fully understands. But there is also the unknown as it appears to you. And those two things are not identical. What surprises you may not surprise someone else. What overwhelms one person might feel completely manageable to another. That's because each person carries a different set of experiences, skills, and assumptions about how the world works. The boundary between the known and the unknown is different for each of us. Imagine two people encountering the same situation. One sees it as a challenge they've handled many times before. The other sees it as something completely unfamiliar and intimidating. The event itself is the same. But the dragon that appears in front of each person is different. That's why personal obstacles can feel so powerful. The things that block your path are often located exactly at the edge of your current understanding. They appear where your knowledge ends and uncertainty begins, and that's where fear tends to live. But there's another side to that encounter that the old stories never forgot. The dragon doesn't just represent danger, it guards treasure. Hidden inside the chaos is something valuable, something you could not access without confronting the unknown itself. That's why the hero in so many stories eventually turns toward the dragon instead of running away forever. The treasure is on the other side of the fear. And when you bring that idea back down to everyday life, the pattern becomes surprisingly practical. Think again about the person frozen by something as simple as a phone call, or anyone who finds themselves blocked by a situation they cannot yet handle. The obstacle sitting in front of them is their personal version of the unknown. The question then becomes very clear. First, what do you actually want? What direction are you trying to move toward? Second, what exactly is standing in your way? And finally, what kind of force inside you is willing to step forward and confront it? Because somewhere in that confrontation, awkward, uncertain, and frightening as it might be, there may be something waiting that you couldn't reach any other way. When you step back, it starts to look like these things. Fear limits, order chaos, aren't separate problems at all. They're different faces of the same human challenge, learning how to act in a world that is always partly known and partly mysterious. Every step forward asks something of us: attention, courage, a willingness to face what we don't yet understand. If this reflection stayed with you, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, and keep exploring these ideas together.